Good morning, boys and girls. Today we are going to read chapter 2 of Classic Starts Peter Pan. Chapter 1 is a very interesting chapter because it lays out kind of the foundation for this story. We're introduced to the Darling family, Mr. and Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Darling seems like a lovely person. Mr. Darling sells stocks. He seems like the banker type who's really serious and worried about what other people think. Mrs. Darling, however, is like most moms. She cares about her kids, she worries about them. And it says Mrs. Darling had never heard of Peter Pan until one day when she was tidying up her children's minds. Like most parents, she was worried about what her children were thinking. And this person named Peter just kept on popping up in her children's minds as they slept. She overheard them talking about Peter. And this had her think because she at first thought she never knew who Peter was, but then she thought maybe when she was a kid, maybe she also was visited by Peter. So that's kind of in the back of her head. Where the Darlings have three children: Wendy, Michael, and John. Actually, John, I think, is the middle child, and Michael is the smallest, the youngest, and Wendy is the oldest. She's the only girl in the Darling family. And the cool thing about the Darlings is their Nana is a dog. So right away, you know that this is a fantasy book because we could not leave dogs to watch our kids. We'd get arrested. So that's a really unusual part of this story. Now in chapter 2 is called Now, Peter, Now. When I'm reading it to you in the first couple of pages, I want you to think of this because this is really important. I want you to think in the back of your head, what scared Mrs. Darling? You cannot not listen and skip that part. So by like the third or fourth page of the reading, if you don't know what scared Mrs. Darling, what I want you to do is pause your video, rewind it to the beginning, and start listening again. Because in chapter 2, the author, J.M. Barrie, what he does is he does lots of foreshadowing. I love this. This is if you want to become a talented author, you're going to try to include this somewhere in your writing. It keeps your reader really interesting. It's called foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is when the author gives advance hints or clues what is to come later in the story. So, for example, you're going to notice that Mrs. Darling finds these leaves in the nursery. Now, nursery is just like the children's bedroom. And she notices that these leaves are not found anywhere in England. Now, remember, this story takes place in, I believe, the late 1800s in England. And she finds leaves, and they're not from around there. So it has her thinking, how are these leaves getting into her child's nurseries? All right. So I'm just going to get started. Remember, what scares Mrs. Darling? What was she scared of in the beginning? And listen out for those hints or clues that Peter Pan is eventually going to come to visit the Darlings again. Children often find even the strangest events rather commonplace. For example, they might casually mention that when they were playing in the woods last Wednesday, they met a ghost and played tag with him on roller skates. It was in just this way that Wendy revealed something quite upsetting to her mother. One morning, Mrs. Darling was tidying up the nursery where all the young Darling children slept and discovered some leaves on the floor. So she asked Wendy about them, but Wendy merely replied, "Oh, Peter must have left those leaves." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Darling asked nervously. "He really is quite messy," said Wendy, who was a very tidy child. Tidy means you're very neat and organized. With a sigh, she explained that Peter often came to the nursery at night and sat at the foot of her bed, playing the flute. "Sweetheart," Mrs. Darling assured her, "the front door is locked at night. No one can get in." "He comes in through the window," Wendy insisted. "He can't possibly. We are 3 stories up." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" her mother cried. I got hungry and forgot, said Wendy, who was now feeling rather hungry again. While Wendy went to look for a snack, Mrs. Darling stayed behind, still frowning about the leaves. The thing that scared her most was that she was fairly certain they were from they certain sorry. The thing that scared her most was that she was fairly certain they were from a tree that did not even grow in England. She searched the room for other clues, but found none. You are making a fuss out of nothing at all, Mr. Darling insisted when she told him. Now come to bed. I suppose you're right, Mrs. Darling said. Only he wasn't. The very next night, she tucked the children in, went downstairs to sit by the warm fire and sew, and fell asleep. Almost immediately, she started to dream. She dreamed that Neverland had drifted too close to the beach, and that a strange boy had jumped into the water and was swimming toward her children. Wendy, John, and Michael were on the shore, happily waving to him. This might have only been a silly dream, were it not for the fact that upstairs the window of the children's bedroom had blown open and a boy really had flown in and dropped onto the floor. With him was a little light, no bigger than a fist, that darted around the room like a mosquito. Mrs. Darling woke up with a start. That means she knew at once that the swimming boy was Peter Pan. She ran upstairs, threw open the door to the children's bedroom, and sure enough, there he was. He was wearing clothes made of leaves, the same strange kind that he had left behind the last time. But the strangest thing about him was that although he must have been very old now, at least as old as she, Mrs. Darling, he still seemed to have all of his baby teeth. When Peter saw Mrs. Darling, he bared those pearly little teeth at her and grinned. Mrs. Darling screamed, and in a split second, Nana was there. She growled too and lunged at Peter. He dodged her and jumped out of the window. Mrs. Darling screamed again. After all, she didn't want the boy dead. And she looked down, but saw no broken body. Looking up, she saw what looked like a shooting star speeding away. When she turned, she saw that Nana had something in her mouth. It was Peter's shadow. Nana had nipped it with her teeth right before Peter jumped, and the shadow snapped off. Nana wanted to hang the shadow out of the window so Peter could come back and get it without bothering the children. That seems like a sensible thing. But Mrs. Darling thought that it would look like laundry drying, and Mr. Darling, who was a little bit of a grump, would be upset if the neighbors saw that. I think I like Nana's idea better. If Nana was able to leave the shadow hanging outside the window, Peter could easily get it without having to come back to the nursery. But Mrs. Darling, who was worried about Mr. Darling, who's a little obnoxious, decided that she could not do that. Instead, she decided to stuff the shadow into the bottom of a drawer, hidden away like one of her children's unpleasant thoughts. If I lost something, that means I would have to go back to the original place I think I lost it and search around to look for it. And I think my shadow is a pretty important thing to misplace. That hard dog, Mr. Darling said when she told him the next day what had happened. She can't go around snapping off people's shadows left and right. Why, we'll get sued. That means that someone will fine you money for doing something wrong. So I guess Mr. Darling obviously knows you can't go around snatching people's shadows. Common sense, right? Poor Nana, and poor Mr. Darling too. He knew he was being awful and unfair, but he couldn't help it. He was frustrated and jealous about other people doing better in the stock market and about the children loving Nana so very much, possibly more than him. It didn't help matters that Nana had brushed up against him yesterday, getting white hair all over his coat. Go to the doghouse where you belong, he yelled at her. George, Mrs. Darling whispered, remember what I told you about that boy? What if he comes back and Nana's not there to guard the children? But Mr. Darling would not listen. He was determined to show everyone who was the master of the house. And so out Nana went. Wow. I don't know. I'd like to keep my dogs in the house. I feel more protected that they're in the house than keeping them outside of the house. That night, as Mrs. Darling was putting the children to bed and lighting their night lights, they heard Nana downstairs in the yard barking. She is just protesting being chained up, John said. Wendy was wiser, however. No, that is how Nana barks when she smells danger, she said. Mrs. Darling shuddered. Outside, she saw a million stars, some of which seemed to her to be hovering around the house, as if trying to get in. Oh, how she wished that she and Mr. Darling did not have to go to a dinner party tonight. Don't worry, Mama, Michael said. Nothing can hurt us when our night lights are lit. Isn't that right? This was something Mrs. Darling had told her children in the past. So she couldn't very well take it back now. That's right, she said soothingly. Night lights are the eyes a mother leaves behind at night to watch over her babies. I love that line. Besides, she told herself, she and Mr. Darling would be so close, only a few houses away. What could possibly happen? Almost like those famous last words from chapter 1. What could possibly happen? Now stop and think for a moment, because while I was reading those pages, there were a couple of clues foreshadowing, giving us a hint of what is to come later in the story. A few minutes later, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were outside, strolling arm in arm to their dinner party. But they were being observed from above. That means they're being watched. It was the stars spying. The old stars were glassy-eyed and bored, but the little ones were curious and full of wonder and winks. They didn't particularly care for Peter, who liked to sneak up behind them and try to blow them out. But they were generally fond of fun, and Peter was all about fun, so they decided to help him tonight. The instant Mr. and Mrs. Darling were safely inside the neighbor's house, a commotion broke out in the heavens. A chorus of the smallest stars in the Milky Way cried out, "Now, Peter, now!" Okay, so your job today is to give me any other things that happened in chapter 2 that foreshadows Peter Pan will be coming back to visit the Darling children. Later on this evening, I will be reviewing your foreshadows, and then tomorrow in a video, we will go over all the ones that were in chapter 2. So be a good detective. And if you don't remember, this is a video. It's awesome. It's unlike me in the classroom. I'm not going to reread the whole chapter, but you can pause and rewind and listen again. Have a great day, guys. I hope you enjoy chapter 2 of Peter Pan.